make a new type of news.
New insights, new styles, and new topics every day.
We are News Generation.
Making news just for you. It's March 27th here in Seoul. I'm Shin Yeun, and this is News Generation, where we make the news at Arirang's very own open studio. Every morning, we'll discuss the top issues and latest current affairs affecting people in their 20s and 30s. Joining me in the studio is Kim Xiang
Good morning, Ian.
and Park Gi-hoon.
Thank you for having me.
Both are here to speak on behalf of those in their 20s and 30s. Now, we're going to start by making a news feed that covers different hashtags and news items that have been trending on social media over the past 24 hours. The first hashtag is Do-kwon. Full name Kwon Do-hyung. Do-kwon was once hailed as a genius for making the cryptocurrency Terraform, but he's now facing multiple criminal charges, mainly securities fraud, that wiped out around $40 billion of investors' money and shook global crypto markets. After months on the run, the 31-year-old was arrested in Montenegro last Thursday after trying to catch a flight using fake travel documents. And the second hashtag is cherry blossoms. You know, spring is here in Korea when you start seeing cherry blossoms fill up the streets. Usually in the capital, Seoul, you have to wait till early April to see these flowers blossom, but this year we've seen cherry blossoms in Seoul bloom from March 25th. And Korea Meteorological Administration also said it was the second earliest bloom seen in Seoul since 1922, and officials explained this to be from higher temperatures. And the last hashtag is Deutsche Bank. Shares in Germany's biggest lender dropped down to 14% on Friday, spreading fears over another potential banking sector crisis. Now, many investors have been on their toes over whether or not they should pull their money out of this bank after seeing U.S.-based Silicon Valley Bank collapse and UBS emergency rescue Swiss Bank. Now, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz said Deutsche Bank had thoroughly reorganized its business model so that it's profitable amid hyped concerns and yet another U.S. Fed interest hikes. Now we're going to talk about one of the three hashtags here in the studio, and we're going to be talking about cherry blossoms, as many in Korea seem to reschedule their plans to see these beautiful spring flowers at iconic sites. So Ki-hoon, were you one of the many that had to cancel or change trip plans to see these cherry blossoms?
You know, I'm actually one of the few lucky ones to live quite close to a cherry blossom attraction site, which is Seokchon Lake. Have you heard of Seokchon Lake?
Oh, just by the Lotte Tower, Lotte World?
Yeah, so it's a lake
there.
that surrounds Lotte World, and it's a beautiful place to see that pink wave of cherry blossoms. And like you mentioned, yeah, it did blossom quite earlier than usual than last year because of the high rise in temperature, and of course it's an alarming sign of global warming. And not just that, you know, March was a month full of, you know, high levels of fine dust, which is
very true.
also, you know, like issues relating to health and environment. So I think we need to take a faster action to tackle these issues so our future generations can enjoy the beauty of nature before it's too late.
Definitely. And Xiong, I think Yoon just mentioned some things that we're seeing from climate change.
Yeah.
But apart from early cherry blossoms, were there any other signs of global warming that you've experienced?
Yeah, I mean, for sure. I mean, actually, a very recent study published by Postec, Pohang University of Science and Technology, found that the abnormally high temperature in Korea that occurred in October 2021 actually was due to global warming. The average temperature in Korea was 19.9 degrees Celsius between the first 2 weeks, October 1st and 15th of 2021, which was 3.9 degrees higher than the previous year's average. This raises serious alarm and calls for immediate action. And if you probably all know, but last Saturday, the 25th of March, we saw Seoul's landmark Namsan Tower turning off its lights for an hour for Earth Hour. 185 countries joined the action, with the likes of the Paris's Eiffel Tower and the European Parliament turning their lights off as well. I mean, yeah, and I'm sure you know all about Earth Hour. Do you want to tell us a little more about it?
Right, definitely. So Earth Hour is an event launched by the Worldwide Fund for Nature, and in 2007 in Sinsan, every March 25th at 8:30 p.m.,
Right.
a lot of companies and different buildings turn off their lights for an hour to raise awareness on climate change. And that was our news feed for this Monday. Moving on to our main discussion topic of the day, with work-life balance becoming increasingly important, more and more people are demanding the right to disconnect after office hours. That's why several countries, including Korea, are seeking to set this type of right in stone. Take a look at the screen. These three words are gaining momentum in Korea. Right to disconnect. That means forbidding work-related texting and calls outside of office hours. Korea has been trying to pass several bills to limit such work-related communication since 2016. but they've either been discarded or are still pending. Earlier this month, the government again said it would push for the right to disconnect to be put to legislation. Talks are underway, but many are hoping that this time it's passed, as the current administration has also called for major labor reforms, such as listening to the new generation and finding out what would be the most appropriate amount of maximum work hours per week. Today, NewsGen looks at 3 questions. 1. Why is the need for the right to disconnect surfaced? 2. How are other countries responding to this demand? How far has South Korea come? 3. How would the new gen like to see the work culture change? So some people consider receiving texts from their coworkers or superiors after work hours to be a big violation of their right to life outside of work, and even to the point where they think it should be illegal. And that's why some Korean officials proposed legislation in March ensuring workers' rights to disconnect from any work-related issues outside of work hours. So Xiong, why don't you first explain to us what exactly the proposal was about?
Yeah, so on the 6th of March, the Ministry of Employment and Labour announced a plan to launch a task force to plan and create policies regarding employees' right to disconnect after work hours. The widespread use of internet messengers, I think, have definitely caused a sort of hyperconnectivity between, your private life and your work life as well. And the task force exactly aims to target this issue by guaranteeing the division between work hours and your personal time.
I see. Then how did this proposal gain momentum in the first place?
It actually became a hot issue when a bill was proposed in the National Assembly for a partial amendment to the Information and Communication Network Use Promotion and Information Protection Act. In simple terms, this proposal especially gained traction from the right for users to leave Korea's popular Kakao Messenger group chat function without notifying the entire chat room. Speaking on the background of the momentum, let's refer to a survey result to assess the situation of employers contacting their employees after work hours. To the question, have you ever been contacted about work outside of work hours, and how do you usually respond? 64.1% of the respondents said yes, and that they have responded accordingly, while 19.4% responded yes, but that they have ignored it and replied to it the next day. 16.5% responded that they had never been contacted outside of work hours.
Very interesting survey right there. And
Yes.
Ki-hoon, you've been working for some time now. So I'm guessing you might be included in that 64.1% of people.
Definitely.
Yeah, you responded.
Have
Yeah.
you received texts outside of work hours?
I have, many times. And for me, I try to stay connected as much as I can, even after working hours.
Sure.
Because, regardless of where I work, if everyone else is staying connected after working hours, I feel pressured to do so as well. So
Yes.
it's something that I don't have much
Peer
choice over.
pressure in a lot
Peer
of
pressure as well.
sense, yes.
But I think a good way to avoid this problem is before you actually start work, if you have the courage to ask your seniors what kind of after-work culture this company has, that could be a good way to avoid these kind of conflicts. And also, in regard to leaving chat rooms, like my approach would be to take a step back and just see the general flow of the chat room, who's leaving, who's not. And once someone leaves before you, then it can be a cue for you to leave as well. So my advice is not doing things first unless it's worthy of praise and not rushing into hasty decisions.
Right, test the waters out first.
Exactly.
But a lot of millennials and Gen Z, including myself, feel that if you get texts or calls after work hours, that's an extension of work, which is why it's so grueling. And I did my own research to find out just how much our generation, especially those in their 20s and 30s, find texting with their colleagues or coworkers after work hours to be frustrating. I didn't even have to go too far. They were here in our NewsGen team. So take a look at the screen. So if you receive a text message after work hours and it's related to work, would you check it?
No. After work hours, I usually turn off the messages from my workplace because I think it's better leave it up to my coworkers who works at the time, and there is no pay. Joke.
Yes, of course, but that's only because I'm new to the company. I feel kind of obliged to check what's happening before and after work, so that I don't make mistakes when I'm back to work. And I also worry if I don't respond to the message, that will kind of work against me in the future in some way or another.
Once you get used to it, do you still want to reply though?
I'm not sure. how long it will last.
So we did try to provide them complete anonymity there, but may it be a lesson for us all. Let's respect our coworkers' life outside of work hours. And here in the studio, what do you guys think about creating laws to restrict work-related texting or calling after work? Xiang, do you agree or disagree to this?
Yeah, I mean, before we actually go into what we think about whether creating laws related to right to disconnect after work hours, let's actually refer to a survey showing whether such a policy would be regarded as rightful or over-regulation in the eyes of the general public. Let's have a look at the screen. In a survey conducted last year, with a sample size of 1,056 office workers, we have an exact tie of 50% to 50% in respondents saying that legislation is needed, as well as opinions that this would be an over-regulation of private sector affairs. Actually, several countries in Europe have put legislation in place to allow employees to disconnect, led by France from the early 2000s. Germany, Italy, Slovakia, Philippines and Canada all have either respectable private sector policies or government legislation which protects workers' rights not to be contacted after work hours. And personally, I do kind of partially agree that there should be something set in law. But to be honest, if you think about, our kind of profession, journalists and things like that, you're a writer for the show as well, Kyun. We need to be contacted after work hours.
Definitely.
Things happen on the go. We've got to be able to be on the spot and respond as whatever time it might be during the day. So I think it really depends on which sector it might be.
Right.
And that's why I only partially agree, because that might hinder the efficiency of work for certain industries.
Definitely. That's a really good point. And Kyung, what are your thoughts on this? Do you agree or disagree to making a law for this?
I agree with disconnecting after working hours, but disagree with the law being enforced immediately because, like I said, introducing a new law may solve the problem right now, but not in the long run. So I thought as well, I fear that a lot of superiors might take advantage of this law by piling on extra work the next day, forcing employees to work extra hours and involuntarily stay back. So that could be catastrophic. And also, before a law is imposed, firms as individual entities should come up with customized working conditions that can really foster both, satisfy both employees and employers, to mitigate conflicts. But I know at the end of the day, it's much easier said than done.
Right.
Yes.
But listening more to younger generations can create a more diverse, creative and innovative company because it's happening across the globe, especially in more developed countries. And these factors are really factors that determine the success of a company moving forward.
And that's what we're going to do now, Kyuhoon. We're going to now hear about what millennials and Gen Z and other parts of the world think about our discussion topic for today. Korea isn't the only country considering legislation to ensure employees' rights to rest after office hours. Several countries in Europe, like France back in 2016 and Belgium in 2022, required employees to switch their work phones off and disconnect after work. And this trend has been spreading to North America as well. Especially with more companies allowing remote work and flexible hours, the line between work and personal life is blurring more than ever. To tell us what's going on in the States, we have a labor and employment lawyer, Charles A. Krugel, with us. Welcome, Charles.
Hi, thank you. Thanks for having me.
All right, Charles, I'll ask you the first question. The U.S. is known for its work hard, play hard culture, but there's still been calls for workers to be given legal protection to enjoy life and personal commitments outside of their jobs. So do you think the U.S. will soon adopt right to disconnect laws, and how's the situation like there?
We're heading in that direction. It's not going to happen. I don't think it'll happen this year. I think it could happen in 2024, 2025. You're right. We are a work hard, play hard type of society, and we relish that. I mean, that's something that we've always been focused on. But yet, because of the change, we've been in constant flux with our workplace, especially during the pandemic, with climate change. You've heard of the Great Resignation, quote unquote, quiet quitting, that type of stuff. So, yeah, I mean, people do want to disconnect. I think it is better for them to disconnect. It's a matter of quality of work versus quantity of work. We'll get there. I can see us heading there. I don't think we're going to have federal law. I think it's going to be state and local law that's going to be regulating that.
I see. And Xiang, do you have any questions for Charles?
Yeah, I mean, Charles, I mean, there are definitely some hurdles to such a legislation, I guess. You know, enacting it might be difficult as well. Some private sector companies might disagree due to the issues of efficiency of the workplace. What do you think would be some of the major hurdles that the legislation could face?
Well, you're right. The business community is probably going to be against it to a large extent, especially the private sector business community, maybe to a lesser extent the not-for-profit business community. So we have a lot of lobbying going on in the states and in cities and Washington, D.C., and the business community is putting billions, maybe trillions of dollars into lobbying local and state elected officials on issues, on workplace-related issues. So I could see them putting money to spend to counter any movement toward the right to disconnect type laws.
Yes.
All right, Charles, last question for you is, what's the work culture like in the States and how could it improve?
Well, we're kind of based on the Protestant work ethic. I mean, that's even before we became a nation in 1770 or in 1776. So we've had this for a few hundred years now. We've seen some diminishment of that, especially relative to, like I said, changes in, the pandemic, climate change. You have changes in technology, obviously changes in technology, but also immigration reform and workplace changes like quiet quitting, great resignation. So I think that our workplace culture is really changing right now. We have a much more diverse workplace, and I think we're trying to catch up to the changes that have been going on. We're changing quicker than I think legislation and our businesses can catch up relative to workplace practices or policies. But we'll have to get there. I mean, there's no doubt about it. Otherwise, we're going to fall behind. You mentioned some of the other nations that are doing these types of disconnect laws, and Ontario, Canada is one of the Canadian provinces that have done this. There's some talk about maybe California will be a bellwether state for the U.S. because they're usually ahead of the curve in terms of workplace-related changes. So, maybe California will come up with something. But it's not, like I said, I don't think it's going to happen this year, though.
I see. So it's definitely tilting towards, though, more of quality rather than the quantity of work.
Well, yeah, to some extent, yeah. And I think we need to get there from a human resources management perspective. I just think it's poor human resources management to emphasize quantity over quality of work. So especially also with the increase of remote working, there's less, to some extent, there's less supervision. And with that, you really have to look at more of the quality of the work rather than the quantity of the work. And then, and also with unionization and the labor organizing in the U.S. on the increase, I think that's going to be a big issue for unions, labor organizing, and workers on the lower end of the wage scale.
All right. Thank you so much, Charles. It was a pleasure to hear from you today.
Have a lovely
Thanks again for having me.
Thank you.
You too.
All right. So here in the studio, any comments that Charles made that you want to talk about?
Yeah, I mean, I think Charles agree to a certain extent how the private sector, especially the business sector, might disagree to an actual legislation being in place to ensure disconnection from workplace. I mean, a lot of sectors, not even just journalism as well, even in finance and things like that, there's always certain emergencies. Every sector has certain emergency at one point.
Right.
And if you're going to be massively fined as a company just because you have to contact your employee after 6 or something, it's going to be slightly ridiculous in the eyes of the company owners and the actual management. And it's not like we all aim to be potentially business owners. We all aim to get up to the management level as well. So I think to a certain extent, I agree with Charles in the fact that it will increase, not human rights issues, we shouldn't go that far, but it will increase working conditions and things like that. But also there might be some hurdles to enacting these laws.
Definitely. And Ki-Hoon, do you have any short comments that you'd like to leave?
I'll keep it short. Quality over quantity.
Definitely.
Right.
Quality over quantity.
Definitely.
I think those are the 3 words that we need to remember today. And let's now hear from our viewers and their thoughts on today's topic. So we asked them, do your boss or coworkers text you after work hours? How do you feel about people texting about work after you get off from work? So take a look at the screen to find out what some of them said. Fizz Water said sometimes they do do contact me, but mainly due to their absent-mindedness, just for upcoming meetings for the week, no work to do on the weekends. And Nia Ramo said, I don't like it at all. I don't have access to my work computer, so I cannot help anyone after working hours. It's one of my pet peeves. And Den Quentin James said at General Electric in the United States, they don't text or call. All issues are handled during business hours. Now, these are some of our viewers' comments, but I think this could be a good segue into the final part of our discussion. So how would you guys like to see South Korea's proposal for the right to disconnect go? And would you like for it to pick up speed? Or are there any things that you think should be solved first before we get that far? Starting with Xiong.
Yeah, I mean, the current government, the Korean government, actually working hard to reorganize the work hour system in all Korean industries. So, I mean, in point of sort of Labor Ministry's view, that does make sense to ensure and guarantee decent working conditions and hours for the benefit of all laborers and office workers in the country. And I think, as I mentioned before, it does depend on the industry to a certain extent, and the right to disconnect might be a difficult, it might be a double-edged sword. It might be a bit difficult to see the boundary where it should be limited and where it shouldn't be. Some of us, as co-workers, we're good friends as well. And if something might piss you off during after work hours, and you might just be able to report someone who you work with for contacting you after work hours. So it's a really sort of vague boundary on how to define work-related calls that should be tolerated or that shouldn't be by law as well.
Definitely, it's really hard to regulate things like that. And what about you, Ki-hoon? Any final thoughts?
Yeah, it's true that we're living in a society that we're way too connected, and it's really difficult to disconnect unless we turn our phones off, which is almost impossible, right? And I just think that, at the end of the day, harmony can bring about peace and happiness, which is what everyone needs and wants, no matter which side you belong to.
Definitely. So we'll definitely have to see where things go. But until then,
peace and harmony.
Love, peace, and harmony. And
quote of the day.
Quality over quantity.
Right.
We have 2 quotes of the day. All right. We'll be here every day from 9:30 a.m. to 10 a.m. Korea time, bringing the topics that young people are talking about. Now, special thanks to Kim Xiong.
My pleasure.
And Park Ki-hoon.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you, everyone, for watching. We'll see you tomorrow. We are
News Generation.